Professor Brian Roberts teaches American literature here in BYU's English department, and he is the coordinator for BYU's American Studies program. He's published widely on topics in Black internationalism and the study of transnational American culture, with a particular interest in cultural traffic between the U.S. and Indonesia. He is currently working on 2 book projects, a collection of translated short stories by the Indonesian modernist Sitor Situmorang, and a single authored book tentatively titled Archipelagoes, Oceans, Americas. The title for today's presentation, which in a very interesting interdisciplinary way brings together a notable American author with an important international conference in a part of the world that is fascinating and complex, Asian-African Solidarities, the 1955 Bandung Conference, and an Indonesian Notebook. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brian Roberts.
Thanks, Corey, and thanks to Kelly Blasian also for helping to arrange for me to speak today. I'm really excited to speak today. I'm going to talk with you today about what grows out of a book that I've recently published with my colleague and friend in Indonesian Studies at the University of Sydney. It's a book titled Indonesian Notebook, a source book on Richard Wright and the Bandung Conference. It was out from Duke in March of this year. It's a book about the famous African-American novelist Richard Wright and his trip to Indonesia in 1955 to report on the Post-Colonial Asian-African Conference, or Bandung Conference as it's usually called. Wright's trip to Indonesia was an extraordinary event. It was an intertwining of the questions and the concerns of the newly post-colonial world with the questions and concerns of one of the United States' most prominent and influential racial spokespeople. As if the convergence needed to be any more extraordinary, we have this that we can add to it. The United States government, via the CIA, covertly funded and orchestrated Wright's trip to Indonesia for the Bandung Conference. And speaking of funding, I do want to mention that I'm grateful for overt funding from the Kennedy Center for a 2013 trip that I took to Indonesia as I was researching this book for archival research in various Indonesian archives, and also to be able to interview Indonesian literary and cultural figures who met Richard Wright in 1955. Here's how the story goes. In December of 1954, as Wright was living in Paris as an expatriate, he picked up the evening newspaper and he gazed in awe when he read that in April of 1955, the government of Indonesia would be hosting a meeting of 29, quote, free and independent Asian and African countries. Gathering in the Indonesian city of Bandung, as Wright learned from the newspaper, representatives from these countries were to discuss, quote, the problems, the position of Asia and Africa and their people in the world of today and the contribution they can make to the promotion of world peace and cooperation. The representatives planned to, quote, consider problems of special interest to Asian and African peoples. For example, problems affecting national sovereignty and racialism and colonialism. Although Wright had published the popularly and critically successful novel Native Son in 1940, and his 1945 autobiography Black Boy had been a #1 bestseller for 3 months, he had left the United States in 1946 to escape continuing and virulent race prejudice. Now, in Paris, after reading about the conference that was to be held in Bandung, Wright told his wife, Ellen Poplar, that his life had given him, as he called them, some keys to understanding this gathering of Asian and African representatives. He explained, I'm an American Negro. As such, I've had a burden of race consciousness. So have these people. I've worked in my youth as a common laborer, and I have a class consciousness. So have these people. I grew up in the Methodist and Seventh-day Adventist churches, and these people are religious. I was a member of the Communist Party for 12 years, and I know something of the politics and psychology of rebellion. These people have had as their daily existence such politics. These emotions are my instruments. They are emotions, but I'm conscious of them as emotions. I want to use these emotions to try to find out what these people think and why. And during the conversation, after Wright had told Ellen, given Ellen this explanation, she said, "If you feel that way, you need to go." So with these emotional keys in hand, Wright arranged to travel to Southeast Asia, where he visited Indonesia for over 3 weeks, from April 12th through May 5th, 1955, and reported as a member of the press on the Bandung Conference, which convened from the 18th to the 24th of April. Based on his 3-week Indonesian sojourn, Wright published his Indonesian and Asian African travelogue, The Color Curtain, a report on the Bandung Conference in 1956. The travelogue ranks among the first substantial accounts of the Asian African Conference, and it's emerged as a touchstone in the conference's scholarly treatments, which have frequently looked toward the Bandung Conference's world historical significance and traced what's been called a Bandung spirit as evolving into the non-aligned movement founded in 1961, and more generally inhabiting what Robert J.C. Young, post-colonial theorist, has called the political formation of post-coloniality. Indeed, recent scholarly work has observed that the Bandung Conference, quote, produced something, a belief that 2/3 of the world's people had the right to return to their own burned cities, cherish them, and rebuild them in their own image. Moreover, the conference has come to crystallize the idea of the Third World as a unity of Asian, African, and Latin American peoples on the basis of a common experience with colonialism and racialism. As Dilip Menon observes, Bandung has attained present-day status as, quote, the condensation of many aspirations, Afro-Asian solidarity, the idea of decoloniality, and the possibility of new alignments in the world following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of a unipolar world. In attaining this explanatory power in relation to post-coloniality's late 20th and early 21st century cultural conditions, the Bandung Conference that Wright went to report on has taken on a mythic dimension in the sense of myth outlined by Wright's Parisian contemporary, Roland Barthes, whose work on myth has found frequent recuperation in the context of post-colonial studies. Appearing a year after Wright's The Color Curtain, Barthes' 1957 book, Mythologies, offers a classic discussion that frames myth as the project of, quote, giving an historical intention, a natural justification, making contingency seem eternal. So myth, for Barthes, becomes something that creates a naturalness or an eternalness, and becomes a mask for that, and that naturalness or eternalness becomes a mask disguising the fact that something that we're looking at is cultural or historically produced. In Mythology's famous example, Barthes illustrates this process through the case of a young Negro in French military uniform who had appeared on the cover of a prominent French weekly magazine of the day. And I will mention that that's a quote from Barthes. Of course, the word Negro was commonly used at this point in history, although it is not commonly used today, and I'll be quoting Barthes using that term. As Barthes observes, this image required, quote, putting the biography of this individual Negro in parentheses in order to naturalize the logic and coherence of the French Empire. Now, I would say that if on one hand, the young Negro appearing on the magazine cover functioned to naturalize the French Empire, then the Bandung Conference, on the other hand, has been equally mythic but it's been an image that stands resolutely against European and American empire as a naturalization of post-colonial ideals and conditions during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Now, like the Bandung Conference, Wright's book, The Color Curtain, has also been mythic, taken up by numerous scholars as a type of narrative in an array of cultural and disciplinary arenas, among them post-colonial studies and Asian African studies. In post-colonial studies, Dipesh Chakrabarty has framed some of Wright's positions in The Color Curtain as anticipatory of, quote, the globalization as liberation discourse in a world after empire. And the most recent edition of the landmark book, Post-Colonial Studies, The Key Concepts, has added an article on the Bandung Conference and has framed Wright's The Color Curtain and the commentary in it on the new Asian and African governments as prescient of, quote, the themes for much of post-colonial writing in the years to come. But no arena of study has suggested greater implications for Wright's book than has the emerging field of Afro-Asian studies. Consider the foreword to the field's landmark 2006 collection, Afro-Asian Encounters, which has Vijay Prashad offering an opening paragraph asserting the book that Wright produced from his Indonesian travels, The Color Curtain, inaugurates our tradition of Afro-Asian studies. In putting together our book, my book with Keith Fulcher, Indonesian Notebook, Keith and I wanted to better understand Wright's Color Curtain and the Afro-Asian encounters that surrounded it. From the outset, we had a sense that the material history behind the Color Curtain might not be so harmonious as the myth might suggest. Consider the reaction that Wright received after publishing a chapter of The Color Curtain in the August 1955 issue of the UK-based magazine Encounter. Appearing shortly after Wright returned from Southeast Asia, the essay generated a brief dialogue between Wright and his former host, the Indonesian novelist, newspaper editor, and pen club member, Mokhtar Lubis. Encounter's March 1956 issue published the following letter from Mokhtar. And I'll just read this in part. With great interest, I read Mr. Wright's Indonesian Notebook in Encounter, number 23. Mr. Wright wrote with great feeling and passion, but I am afraid while he was here in Indonesia, he had been looking through colored glasses, and he had sought behind every attitude he met color and racial feelings. The majority of people with whom Mr. Wright had come into contact in Indonesia, one of the best-known novelists and others, belong to the new generation in Indonesia, and they are the least racial and color conscious of the various groups in Indonesia. They are all amazed to read Mr. Wright's notebook, in which Mr. Wright quotes them saying things they never had said, or to which they did not put meaning as accepted by Mr. Wright. Mokhtar continues, I do not want to imply that there's no color feeling in Indonesia, but I want to protest Mr. Wright's allegation that this racial business has become a way of life in Asia. This is just not true. While Mr. Wright's notebook makes interesting reading, I'm afraid he failed to present a true and balanced picture of the intellectual situation in Indonesia today. Color or racial problems are just not our problems. And alongside Mokhtar's protestation, Encounter published Wright's reply, which denied Mokhtar's suggestion that he had looked at Indonesia through colored glasses. And instead, it asserted that for 3 weeks, while Wright stayed in Indonesia, he said, all the talk I heard was of race and religion. With the speeches at the Bandung Conference loaded with race and religion, he continued, I would commend to Mr. Lubis's attention the full and definitive account of my Bandung report, which will be published in the United States in March of this year under the title The Color Curtain. There I discuss in detail the nature of the racial feeling I found not only in Indonesia, but in the Asian personality as a whole. Think hard, my friend Lubis, and you will recall the discussions that took place in your car as we drove through the Java Mountains. So this looks like a personal exchange. It looks like something that happened between two different writers. And it looks like it might not be all that relevant to big international questions. But I would claim that it is. I would claim that it has a lot to do with maybe not international diplomacy from the top down, but international diplomacy in its cultural form. It's important to remember that Richard Wright's attendance at this conference was funded by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. It's important to remember that the Congress for Cultural Freedom at this time billed itself as a free and independent Congress dedicated to peace and intellectual freedom in the face of Soviet-style totalitarianism. And Wright, he didn't have a sense at that time that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was funded, that it was a front organization for the CIA, although he did have a sense that it was funded by somebody. He had enough understanding of his own situation and history to know that when Congresses and other organizations start using the word freedom, probably the United States government is somehow involved. And one of the things that he wrote to his literary agent was that he thought that it was covertly funded by the U.S. State Department. He was just a little off. By the 1960s, we knew that it was funded by the CIA. And so Wright had gone to them looking for funding. And the CCF, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, immediately apparently saw something useful in a diplomatic exchange, that they could, a culturally diplomatic exchange that they could arrange between Wright and Indonesian writers. And the CCF director, who was both the CCF director and a CIA agent, wrote a letter to Wright that said, "I'm sure that Mr. Lubis will be delighted to be of assistance to you. And on the other hand, you will find him charming, interesting, and well-informed. I have suggested to Mr. Lubis that while you are in Jakarta, you may want to talk at the Pen Club there." And indeed, Mokhtar, Mr. Lubis, helped Wright to arrange to be able to speak at the Pen Club there. And so things were shaking out as Michael Josselson was hoping they would. And it's an interesting case study to see how this CCF orchestrated artistic cultural exchange ramified both at the time and throughout the ensuing decades. One way to think about this would be through the metaphor or the idea offered by Liam Kennedy and Scott Lucas of the state-private network, the collaboration between official U.S. agencies and private groups and individuals in the development and implementation of programs in support of U.S. foreign policy. And then so the question is, how could sending Richard Wright, this famous African-American novelist who had left the United States because of racism, how could that help? How could it help to send him to Indonesia to interact with Indonesian writers? Well, there were already a few bridges between Richard Wright and Indonesia in place. One of them was announced in 1951 by the Indonesian Embassy at Washington, D.C., where they published a book on Indonesian literature and culture. This was a new book for a new nation. It had only gained its recognized independence in 1949, and by 1951, they were publishing a book about Indonesian writing and culture. And here we have a quote on the most famous of Indonesian writers today, Pramudia Nantatur, who was just emerging at the time. So the Indonesian embassy says, A young prose writer who has attracted attention in recent years is P.A. Tour. His works reflect especially the influence of Steinbeck and Richard Wright. And this wasn't just the Indonesian embassy making a statement about or hypothesizing a relationship between Wright and Pramudia. Rather, we have a quote from Pramudia in 1952 in an essay that he wrote saying, "Bitter realism doesn't present the reader with beauty, but with the facts that have to be swallowed raw. In Richard Wright's Black Boy, the reader sees how fear takes hold, with no reference to beauty whatsoever. The much vaunted concept of beauty has no place in Wright's prose, none." And so oftentimes if you say that a piece of writing has no beauty to it, that's an insult. But for Pramudia Anantatur, this was a high compliment. This was something that Wright was doing well, Pramudia believed, something that was worthwhile to be modeled, something that Indonesian modernists could take up, where there was a clear analogy in Pramudia's mind between the colonial violence, the imperial violence that Indonesians had been subjected to, and the racialized violence that Richard Wright and other people of African descent and people of color more generally in the United States had been subjected to. It was Wright for Pramudia was a key to being able to tell the truth about the post-colonial situation. There was something in his experience of African-American life in the United States that was a key. And so, of course, Michael Josselson might have opted to help Wright and Pramudia get together. But that's not how it actually happened. Rather, what happened was Josselson set Wright up with Mokhtar Lubis. And Lubis was part of another literary group in Indonesia at this time. He was part of a group that's since been called the Universal Humanists. Pramudia had started out as a Universal Humanist, but by the time of Wright's visit, Pramudia was moving to the left. The Universal Humanists were more to the right. And what I've got here is kind of a cheat sheet of Indonesian writers and cultural figures that Mokhtar Lubis handed to Richard Wright when he got to Indonesia. And you see that Lubis typed out these lists. So he's got Habe Yasin, Sultan Takdiralis Yabana, Azrul Sani, some artists down here. And then, as an afterthought, Mokhtar says, wait a minute, there is somebody else who Wright maybe should, if not meet, at least know about. And so let me write this in after I've already typed it. And here it is. Pramudia Anantatur, novelist, in my personal opinion, in some way influenced by Richard Wright. It wasn't really just a personal opinion because Pramudia had openly professed his inspiration by Richard Wright. But these were not people but Pramudia was not somebody that the CCF organized for Wright to meet. Rather, like I say, he went among the Universal Humanists, which put him into a different milieu. He went to Indonesia, he came back from Indonesia, and he wrote about his experiences with these Universal Humanists. And here's one account that he gave. Mokhtar is there. Mokhtar Lubis is there. He's in the account, but he's kind of silently in the account. So this was Wright's report after getting back from Indonesia. This morning, I went into the Ministry of Information for a press card so that I could attend the Bandung conference, which was to take place in a few days. And so he's writing it as if it's a journal. At one desk, I saw a white American newspaper man leaning forward intently and putting up an argument. And the Indonesian official to whom he was so urgently talking was obviously not listening and had already made up his mind as to the kind of negative answer he was going to serve up. But the moment he saw my face, or saw me, his manner changed at once. While the white American waited, I got my press card at once. I was a member of the master race, and I thought of all the times in the American South when I had had to wait until the whites had been served before I could be served. And so Wright was seeing structures of racialism and power that were analogous to what he had seen in the United States, but he was seeing them as as some people say, in reverse. And so this is a really intriguing moment, and it's been something that's been seized on by several scholars as they've written about Wright's experience in Indonesia. But one of the things that Keith Fulcher and I uncovered as we were working on this book was an essay written by a Dutch Indonesian intellectual, Beb Fouk, who wrote an essay in 1960 called A Weekend with Richard Wright. And here we get a different version of the same incident. "You got here quickly," says Fouk. "It all went smoothly," Mokhtar replied. "A whole crowd of foreign journalists arrived on the same plane, and they all headed off first to information to get themselves accredited. When we arrived, there was already a long line. Luckily, I knew the man at the desk, so I went round the back, and we were finished in 5 minutes." Fouk continued, "The assistance that Mokhtar's friend had rendered in expediting Richard Wright's press card so that Wright would not have to stand in line is in Wright's account transformed into a touching little story about one colored man helping another in a display of mutual solidarity." And so Wright had said some things that his Indonesian host didn't find to be accurate, had interpreted situations in racial ways that they didn't find to be true. Whereas Wright says, there's racism going on here. Fouk and Mokhtar are saying, that wasn't racism. That was simply my friend helping. And I do agree with Fouk and Mokhtar that there was something different going on in that line than Wright's assessment would have us believe. It wasn't, I would say, properly maybe analogous to the Jim Crow segregation of the U.S. South of the time. But one of the things that I do want to add is systemic racism, or racism that's embedded in our society, oftentimes doesn't operate in overt ways. If you get special privileges based on who you're friends with or who you're related to, and that has to do with race, then there is something racial going on that's not quite so clearly assessed as racism by a lot of people. Mokhtar and Fouk might not have been seeing that fully. Then again, I'm also an outsider like Wright, and I'm not from the Indonesian culture in 1955, so I want to let that question hang rather than pursue it further. Wright did give a lecture at the Penn Club, just as Michael Josselson had suggested. And in the lecture, and it was originally and only published in Indonesian. And so Keith and I, with the help of a few colleagues, with a lot of help from a few colleagues, were able to recover this lecture, find it in a newspaper, in the newspaper Indonesia Raya, which was Mokhtar Lubis's newspaper, realize that it was only published in Indonesia, and then make a back translation of it. And so these are some of the things that Wright had to say in his lecture. In my discussions with several Indonesian writers, I've gained the impression that there are a lot of people in Indonesia asking why the novel is not as developed here as people would like it to be. Perhaps one of the reasons is that Indonesia has not yet seen the rise of a middle class, a class that has freed itself from the structures of a feudal society and launched itself on a path toward a new future, consciously in search of experience. So right there you see, you have a picture of this cultural diplomacy that Wright was engaging in at the behest of the CCF. He was interacting intensely with Indonesian writers, talking with them about their aesthetic concerns, trying to come to some conclusions, tentative, some hypotheses about how their concerns had manifested themselves. And he was also, in this second quote that I've got here, remarkably prescient in relation to Indonesian politics and art. He says, suppose as a writer you support the man in power in 1950, only to find that in 1955 a new man comes to power. In 1955 you might be shot for having supported the leaders who were in power in 1950. So, young writers, enter the political arena, go in search of glory and money, but don't be surprised if you end up losing your head. And this really did become true for a lot of Wright's hosts and a lot of the universal humanists. They either needed to go into exile, self-imposed exile, or be imprisoned. Mokhtar was shortly thereafter imprisoned because of the government's disagreement with Mokhtar's politics. And Pramudia Anantatur was also imprisoned for a long time. But Wright, like I say, Wright, he wasn't quite assessing everything in an accurate way. Here's another quotation. Richard Wright once, and this is from an essay written by an Indonesian filmmaker, one of the early Indonesian filmmakers, Azrul Sani, who reviewed one of Wright's novels, The Outsider, and he gave it a negative review. He had negative things to say about The Outsider, which is similar to a lot of assessments of Wright's novel, The Outsider, internationally at the time. But he concluded his review by bringing this up. Richard Wright once made a visit to Indonesia. This was just a year after. After he left, he wrote in a French magazine, that in Indonesian lavatories, all you found was a bottle or bucket filled with water because the Indonesian people were no longer willing to import toilet paper from Europe at exorbitant prices. This was just ignorance, or the original Indonesian you could translate as this was just stupidity. But Keith and I decided to translate it as ignorance. Reporters make even more ignorant remarks in the reports they file from Indonesia. But The Outsider is a failure of judgment, and failures of this kind are very dangerous for a writer. And so, interestingly, Wright's post-Indonesian writings, again, wound up being kind of a thorn in the side of his relationships with Indonesian writers. And on one hand, you might think, well, that is too bad for the Congress for Cultural Freedom because undoubtedly they would want to be building bridges. That's what cultural diplomacy is about, right? About building bridges. And yet that doesn't seem to be what, for the CCF, cultural diplomacy, at least during this moment, was about. During the process of our research, Keith and I found the minutes of one of the CCF meetings that referred to Richard Wright, and they weren't talking about building bridges. They were talking about starting controversy. And so here's a quotation. Here's some text drawn from our book. The CCF at this time was especially attuned to the attractiveness of controversial articles or articles made controversial by inviting discussion and counterattack, and Wright's lengthy report on his impressions of the rise of Asian nationalism, and especially a new and dangerous racism, with strong mystical religious elements, seems to have played a part in the editor's feelings that the Richard Wright treatment of Bandung and Indonesia might provide the proper point of departure. And so what we've got in Indonesian Notebook then becomes an investigation of the messiness of what the CIA, through the CCF, was trying to do. From this perspective, the color curtain and its surrounding Indonesian archive become relevant to an exploration of the contours of a specific approach that the United States took in attempting to intervene in the Bandung Conference and its representation to an international readership. In paying for his travel and orchestrating his contacts, the CCF was inserting Wright into a community of Indonesian universal humanist writers who were specifically interested in cultural exchange with the rest of the world. As stated in their testimony of beliefs, their sort of manifesto, they not only considered themselves to be heirs to world culture, but envisioned, quote, Indonesian culture as determined by a multitude of stimuli coming from all corners of the world, hurled back at the world in our own voice. This dedication to world culture prompted these Indonesian writers to seek out exposure to other cultures, and intriguingly, they often engaged in cultural traffic with the rest of the world via the same organization that funded Wright's Indonesian travels. Taken in this context, our book, Indonesian Notebook, becomes a crucial tool for not only understanding the Bandung Conference as a touchstone moment within multiple arenas of study, but also for assessing a moment when a major African-American writer traveled for a and his travel for a conference emerged as a vehicle for furthering the CCF's CIA-funded work in cultural diplomacy. Wright's trip offered Indonesia's universal humanists an experience with world culture that they could, to draw from their own manifesto, subsequently re-articulate, hurled back to the world in their own voice. Hence, the unwieldy vicissitudes of transnational cultural exchange among literary and cultural modernists intersect with the United States' uneven efforts at shaping the Asian-African Conference's geopolitical outcomes. Last year, during the 60th anniversary of the Bandung Conference, the popular Indonesian magazine Tempo published a special issue dedicated to the Bandung Conference, placing Richard Wright's trip to Indonesia front and center. And so clearly, I would argue, the U.S. orchestrated impact on the conference's representation is still having political ramifications. Thank you.
So we've got a couple minutes for questions. You know the drill. Please come up to the microphone, tell us your name, what you're studying. As you're collecting your questions coming up, let me just lead out. From what I understand, the Bandung Conference was highly orchestrated and was carefully crafted as kind of a public event. And some people have talked about it as kind of the start of the study of sort of stagecraft as diplomacy. Was there any indication in any of the writings or perspectives from some of the cultural figures on that or on the conference as sort of stagecraft rather than as authentic kind of uproarious political adventure?
Yes, there certainly was. In fact, the essay, A Weekend with Richard Wright by Beb Folk, talks specifically about the universal humanist skepticism regarding the conference. So one would think that Indonesian writers and cultural figures would be, deeply enthusiastic about the Bandung Conference, but they disagreed with the government on a lot of issues, not simply on the Bandung Conference. They saw the government as failing at home, and they saw the Bandung Conference as a highly orchestrated move on the international stage where a big international success could put the government on the map, could make amends for, where success internationally could make amends for failure domestically.
Other questions?
My name is Olivia Stubbs. I'm a molecular biology major. I was wondering what were some of the direct effects, besides maybe these books that were published, of the Bandung Conference?
The direct effects wind up being it's kind of difficult to say. People will contest the idea that one of the direct effects was the non-aligned movement. But a lot of people will say that one of the direct effects was the non-aligned movement. One of the continuing direct effects winds up being the mythological component of the Bandung Conference, where people tend to care generally more about the fact that it happened than they have done research on what actually happened on the ground. So that people will say, you know, maybe as they're working on in the field of post-colonial studies, third world studies, Afro-Asian studies, they'll refer to a post-Bandung world, and that world is, and when you say post-Bandung world or in the world after Bandung, Bandung signifies in the present day a united front against colonialism, imperialism, a united front against major powers who would stymie the independence of less powerful countries.
This has just been a fascinating lecture on cultural diplomacy and things. You know, my understanding of the Bandung Conference comes completely from my understanding of Chinese foreign policy, and it's a big, huge issue for the Chinese. We even use the name Bandung as to define a certain period in Chinese foreign policy. Did Richard Wright in any of his writings mention interaction with Chinese? Did he interact with any Chinese? Did the Chinese agenda or their behavior influence him at all? Any comments on that?
Yes, he talked a lot about China. Now, Wright had been a communist, or he had been a deep communist sympathizer for quite a while. He said that he was a communist for 12 years, although I think there's some doubt as to whether he was actually a card-carrying communist. By the time he went to the Bandung Conference, he had written an essay called "I Tried to Be a Communist," where he, perhaps unfairly, perhaps fairly, describes communism's unwillingness to permit individual thought. So by the time he was going to Indonesia, he was disaffiliated with communism, although he saw communism as a great, he saw the dialectic as a great thought instrument. But his book revolves around, or at least the concluding chapter of his book revolves around the idea that if the United States doesn't get its racial house in order, there are plenty of people in China who will be more than happy to be racially accommodating to the to people of color throughout the world, and also people of color in the United States. And so, and he repeated this a few times in the concluding chapter of his book. This is the last call to the West. If you don't get your racial house in order, China's going to move in, and people of color all over the world are going to identify with the Chinese rather than with the United States.
Did you ever visit China?
To my knowledge, he never did visit China. I don't think he did.
All right. Well, please join me in thanking Professor Roberts.